Hi, I'm Samuel C. Spitali, author of How to Win the War on Truth. In this video, we'll look at the truth about marijuana. Over the years, marijuana and the cannabis plant from which it's derived has gone through various stages of social acceptance and criminalization. In the 1600s, a form of cannabis called hemp was farmed to produce rope, clothing, and paper. By the 1800s, cannabis was sold openly at pharmacies and used in over-the-counter remedies. In the early 1900s, Mexican immigrants who came to the U.S. after the Mexican Revolution popularized the recreational use of the drug. But as Americans' anti-immigrant sentiment grew, so did their prejudice toward the killer weed. It provoked a propaganda campaign called the Marijuana Menace. Detractors even changed the spelling of the name marijuana with an H to marijuana with a J in order to further link it to Mexican immigrants. By the 1930s, more than half the U.S. had outlawed the drug. Prohibitionists associated it with the so-called satanic music of jazz, as well as with the black musicians who performed it. And anti-drug activists claimed it made people violently insane, as depicted in the 1936 propaganda film Reefer Madness. In the 1940s, the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, led by teetotaler Harry J. Anslinger, scared people into thinking the demon weed was a gateway drug that led to heroin addiction and even death. In the 1960s, weed became associated with a lack of sexual inhibition, lack of motivation, poor grooming, and insubordination, all traits identified with the era's counterculture. By the early 1970s, President Nixon commissioned a panel to get to the bottom of the marijuana debate. The report concluded that marijuana was not harmful, that it did not lead to violent crime, and that it should be decriminalized, just as the New York Academy of Medicine report concluded before it. In fact, marijuana use actually inhibited criminal behavior, a consensus later reached by most scientific studies. Even the report's title underscored its findings: Marijuana, a Signal of Misunderstanding. The report also debunked the notion of weed being a gateway drug. Quite the contrary. When Nixon's Defense Department cracked down on marijuana use by troops stationed in Vietnam, soldiers turned to the only substance they could get their hands on: heroin. As much as 15% of troops became addicted to heroin, roughly the same amount as perished on the battlefield. And unlike marijuana, heroin is not only addictive but deadly. Further disproving the gateway drug theory, as the number of pot users have skyrocketed in the last half-century, the number of hard drug users has remained relatively static. In places where recreational marijuana is illegal, young adults often resort to the same behavior as our troops. They consume whatever they can acquire. This can be anything from bath salts to synthetic marijuana, which isn't marijuana at all, but a toxic chemical compound made in laboratories and even deadlier than heroin. Richard Nixon, however, rejected the marijuana report because it didn't serve his political objectives. Instead, Nixon launched a war on drugs, criminalizing cannabis and classifying it as a Schedule I drug, which meant it had no medicinal value, was highly addictive, and more dangerous than cocaine or meth, all of which Nixon knew to be untrue. In addition to cannabis, Nixon also included LSD, magic mushrooms, ecstasy, and heroin as Schedule I drugs, while the lesser classification of Schedule II drugs include cocaine, opium, and fentanyl, all three of greater concern than weed or mushrooms. So what did the Schedule I drugs have in common to warrant such a high classification? They were used almost exclusively by the counterculture, for which Nixon had the utmost contempt. As Nixon's domestic policy chief John Ehrlichman explained it, the Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies: the anti-war left and black people. We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. This tactic wasn't novel. Just a few years earlier, J. Edgar Hoover used the same approach to put his enemies in jail. He wrote in a memo to FBI agents, "Since the use of marijuana and other narcotics is widespread among members of the New Left, you should be alert to opportunities to have them arrested by local authorities on drug charges." For years, because of the war on drugs, the medical community were prohibited from studying the medicinal properties of cannabis simply because it was politically expedient for Nixon to lump it in with all the other drugs. But times have changed, and marijuana is slowly being decriminalized. As of 2024, over half the states in the U.S. have legalized some form of the marijuana plant. and it is now used to treat a variety of conditions, from glaucoma to seizures to cancer, and to help manage chronic pain, PTSD, ADHD, MS, anxiety, depression, diabetes, arthritis, and even inflammatory bowel disease. The biggest resistors to legalizing marijuana have also changed. They are no longer state and federal governments or teetotalers. They're the alcohol industry protecting its recreational drug turf, pharmaceutical companies protecting their market share, and for-profit prisons protecting their business model. While the dangers of drug use are still widely discussed, alcohol continues to kill around 95,000 people a year, and opioids 50,000 people a year. Meanwhile, the number of recorded overdose deaths from marijuana remains at 0. But that doesn't mean marijuana is 100% safe. Chronic marijuana users show long-term cognitive decline by as much as 8 IQ points. And research shows that cannabis use poses a modest risk for mental disorders such as schizophrenia. One study revealed that heavy cannabis use during the teenage years increased the risk of schizophrenia later in life by 600%. As more states move to legalize marijuana and Congress considers decriminalizing it at the federal level, we can expect further research into both its medicinal benefits and possible health risks. To read more, check out my book, How to Win the War on Truth, and be sure to like and subscribe. Special thanks to Alan Wincup for the illustrations, and thank you for watching.